What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Recently there was a proposal to tax childless couples in Russia. Even though this was just a proposal, it did make it into the major news during prime time hours. Almost every Telegram channel and independent news media was talking about it. Just the proposal itself, not the law, already made so many people angry. And not just couples without kids, but families with children as well. And while it may sound absurd at first, like how is war in Ukraine and childless couples taxation related, just as many other stupid and not well thought proposals in Russia are. In reality, when you think about it, you can clearly see the signs of a Russian budget holding literally by a thread. Every ruble counts, the war is extremely expensive, but Putin will never acknowledge it. Instead, through his cronies and other low-level government representatives, a bunch of nonsense proposals are made almost weekly, just to see which are the ones that cause less backlash from the people of Russia, and those which are more or less ignored, quietly adopted as laws in one of the future State Duma meetings. Today, guys, let's talk about even more signs of Russian military budget getting thinner every day, what Putin is doing about it, and the total disconnect between the people and the government of Russia. The recent stories around taxing childless couples in Russia have been pushed by various members of parliament and public figures. Despite the heated discussions, it is crucial to recognize that this proposal is most likely never going to make it to becoming an actual law. The Russian government traditionally avoids imposing obvious taxes that directly affect millions of its citizens, because this one is as clear as 2 plus 2. You don't have kids, you pay this tax. You have kids, you don't need to pay. There are millions of families that do not have children for various reasons. Those who are too young to have them, those who are planning to have children once their own lives are stable, some families prefer not to have children at all. And what about those families who can't have kids due to medical natural reasons? Separating people in clearly two defined groups, those with kids and those without them, is a very unthoughtful decision, and reviewing each case individually in order to decide whether a family has to pay taxes or not will be a bureaucratic nightmare. In a very unlikely case scenario, if the proposal does get approved, this can bring dozens or even hundreds billions of rubles into the budget, up to a couple $billion. But this new possible taxation is just way too obvious. Instead, the Russian government prefers more hidden methods of revenue generation, such as value-added taxes included in the price of the goods and services, duties, customs fees, and fines, which they can slowly increase from time to time, quickly mentioning this insignificant increase a couple of times in the news and then hoping that people will just simply not notice. Direct taxation that is visible and affects a broad base of the population runs contrary to the government's usual practices. Implementing a childlessness tax would not only be logically challenging, but also politically risky. Collecting a nominal amount would cost more in enforcement than it would generate in revenue. If the tax was substantial, it would initiate significant public backlash without making a meaningful dent in the federal budget. The government is aware that such a move could open a Pandora's box of dissent, similar to the unrest caused by previous unpopular policies. Direct taxes also play a fundamental role in shaping the relationship between the government and its citizens. Some individuals who are aware of the taxes they pay tend to scrutinize government actions more closely, demanding accountability for corruption, inefficiency, and misguided policies. And then, these are the very same people who bring these problems of unreasonable taxes to masses, spreading the news and making even more people to become dissatisfied. This heightened awareness could undermine the government's control and provoke demands for greater transparency and representation. These are the outcomes that the current regime tries to avoid, obviously, at all costs. The discussions around the childlessness tax highlight two pressing concerns for the Russian government: a shortage of funds and a declining population. The state is actively seeking additional revenue streams to address budgetary shortfalls exaggerated by various factors, including international sanctions, economic mismanagement, corruption, and of course, the biggest of them all, the war in Ukraine. Officials have already hinted at tapping into citizens' banks' deposits and raising existing taxes. Starting in 2025, for example, the government plans to abandon its flat income tax policy and switch to progressive taxation similar to the one they use in the United States. First of all, it is way more complicated to understand for a regular person, so the hope from the government is that there will be fewer questions. And secondly, progressive tax system will bring a lot of new money into the budget. The corporate tax rate is set to increase to 25% as well. The draft federal budget also indicates hikes in energy bills and inflation rates. Fees for services, such as filing for a divorce, are set to rise significantly, signaling the government's intent to extract more from its population at all costs. Now you can clearly see why these changes to government revenue generating are much more hidden and subtle than this direct childless taxation, for example. What the government is doing is basically changing the way it collects money and increases the so-called hidden fees. And the number of changes is just so great, only those willing to learn all the new things, they're the ones who will be able to see the difference. The rest 99% will continue paying their taxes like nothing happened. At the same time, there is also growing concern about the population decline. Despite public promotions of traditional family values, birth rates have reached historic lows. What a surprise! The government tells you to make more babies, tries to enforce these policies, and mysteriously, it doesn't work. The government appears to believe that increasing the birth rate could address labor shortages and bolster its long-term strategic interests, including military conscription. There is only one crucial thing they forget. At least 18 years needs to pass in order for this new generation to become new working power and to be able to be drafted into the military. When you think that your government is stupid, just remember Russian politicians who thought that forcing families to have kids will solve the labor shortage within a couple of years, like toddlers, infants will be working in the factory. But knowing the Soviet approach, you got an order, comrade, and I don't care how you're gonna do it, just do it. Well, knowing this approach, all this might actually start making sense, why these proposals were made in the first place. These strategies and attempts to save the day reveal us the government going through financial and demographic changes. They are reluctant to implement long-term policies that could genuinely stimulate economic growth or improve public welfare. Instead, the focus remains on short-term fixes that risk further alienating the population. The proposal of a childlessness tax and the public's reaction to it reveals a huge gap between the Russian government and its people. The authorities' perception of the population appears increasingly distant, viewing citizens as both a resource to be exploited and a burden to be managed. Public statements by officials often reflect indifference to the realities faced by ordinary Russians. There is a persistent narrative that the people are not fulfilling their supposed obligations to the state, whether by not having enough children or by failing to support governmental initiatives unconditionally. And these are the softest statements that they make, because several times in the past, as you guys might remember, the government authorities were literally blaming and shaming those Russian men who are not willing to give up their lives in Ukraine, saying that this is the generation of spoiled brats who only think about themselves and their own well-being, and nobody is willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the motherland anymore. And yes, this was said by the very same officials who have all of their kids studying outside the country, just in case something happens. The government's attempts to control personal aspects of citizens' lives, such as family planning decisions, intrude into individual freedoms and provoke resentment. The public's fundamental expectation is that the government should serve the people, not dictate personal choices or impose additional burdens without clear justification or benefit. The lack of open dialogue and genuine engagement with citizens' needs contributes to an environment of mistrust and apathy. People become less inclined to participate constructively in society when they feel that their voices are ignored or their rights are being eroded. This disconnect undermines social unity and could lead to an increased instability over time. The culmination of these issues points to a government struggling with dysfunction and a lack of strategic vision for the future. The persistent focus on policies that are unpopular, impractical, or both indicates a leadership that is out of touch with the population and perhaps even with the practicalities of governance in general. The government's inability to effectively address corruption, economic challenges, and social concerns exaggerates public dissatisfaction. When officials prioritize policies that serve short-term interests or personal needs over the common good, the long-term consequences can be severe. Economic decline, social unrest, and a loss of international standing are potential risks of such continued mismanagement. And just like we talked about it previously, the entire Russian government is based on the idea that no bad news should ever reach your superiors. That is exactly why, when the problems do arise inevitably, it is way too late to solve them using conventional methods. And since problem solving is not also the best skill the Russian government has, after all, it is much easier to blame and fire somebody. The decision to ignore the problems and hope that they're gonna resolve themselves is the one that is frequently taken. What else would you expect from the regime when the highest of its leaders operate in this way for over 2 decades, serving as an example to their own subordinates? The risk is not only domestic but also extends to Russia's position on the global stage. And also it severely affects the future outcome of the war in Ukraine. We spoke about a dozen other reasons why under normal circumstances, the longer the war goes on, the fewer chances Russia comes out as a victor. Personnel shortages, very tight budget and constant lies, fake promises and unattainable dreams are all gonna compound and explode in the face of the decision makers. And highly unlikely Putin will be a fan of such splash in the face. Well, there you have it, guys. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like this video, subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. If you wish to support my work, there are links down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow. We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.